and on and on. And then it was me, and now we're here. Okay. You arrived to Copenhagen yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not your first time in Copenhagen, right?
I've been here many times.
Yeah. So anything you do when you're in Copenhagen, like something you need to do when you're here?
Oh, that's the hardest question, I thought. That wasn't in the script. Walk around.
Walk around.
Yeah. I don't have a bicycle here, but really enjoy walking around.
Any buildings in particular?
You have so many pretty buildings around, and the visage is just really nice.
But you didn't go swimming, did you?
No.
No. Next time you'll go swimming.
Yeah.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. I need to know, how many trained economists do we have in the audience? Okay, it's nothing to be embarrassed about. Okay, but I think it's...
We didn't ask them where they were trained.
Yeah, but they call them economists anyway. Okay. Oh, Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, let's give him a hand.
Hi, nice to see you. Okay, good to see you.
Wow. The reason I ask about the numbers of economists in the audience is because, you said yes to teach us a class of economics, that you will educate us in economics in 5 minutes. You will learn us the 3 most important concepts.
Okay, well, that was all. When he asked me to try to summarize all of what people do for years and years in 5 minutes, that's a real challenge. So I suppose the first thing is resources are scarce, and the essential questions are what gets produced, how it gets produced, for whom it gets produced. But a fourth question that is often not focused upon is who decides the answers to these questions. And that's really almost on the verge of politics, but it's really a key issue. So the second basic idea is markets are an important mechanism for answering those questions, for allocating resources. But markets are only one of the mechanisms. And over the last 50 years, we've learned both the strengths of markets, but also the limits, when and why they often don't work. So right now, I think you're seeing energy markets not working very well in Europe. And that's just one example. We see lots of, in the US, we've had we had shortages of baby formula. Markets didn't work. We've had exploitation. The drug companies caused the opioid crisis, where life expectancy has been going down in the United States for years now. So there are these huge problems, as well as strengths, and trying to understand the richer ecology.
So what about the concepts of notions of inflation, interest rates, supply, demand, Phillips curve, Keynes, Karl Marx, Ricardo, all this they teach at the university. You don't need to know all these concepts in order to become an economist.
Well, they're useful, and that gets you into some of the controversies. I mean, obviously, if markets worked perfectly, there wouldn't be unemployment. And there are some economists who actually believe there's no such thing as unemployment. They say that when people are unemployed, they're just enjoying leisure. And my response to that is usually when people are enjoying leisure, they're happy. But when people are unemployed, they do things like families break up, their suicide rates go up. They're all symptoms that they're not happy. And so it's very clear the market often doesn't work.
So sum up scarcity, the way markets work, that they're imperfect, and that politics matters. That's the
right.
most, okay. So now you're all trained economists, and afterwards you can pick up a diploma and you can put it on your resume. Inflation, the current economic turmoil, like everything is up in there. It's such an exciting time to be an economist.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
But
But today, like we had the inflation figures out in Denmark, 8.9, in the US is 8.5, in the European Union it's 9.5. Like, what is going on? Should we be excited or scared?
well, I think both. I think you should be scared because I'm almost sure that the central banks, the ECB and the Federal Reserve, are going to mess it up. And they're going to mess it up because I think they're going to raise interest rates too fast, too far, and cause an economic downturn. And this is an example. You were, mentioning a number of names. Ideology plays a very big role in economics, and even in, quote, scientific economics. So people, if you're a central banker, one of the things that happens is it gets into your DNA that whenever you see inflation, you raise interest rates, whatever the cause, whatever the consequence. That's what, if you're a central banker, that's what you do. But this inflation is not like a normal inflation. A normal inflation, but usual inflation is there's excess demand. It could be because the government's printed too much money or expenditures are too high, but there's excess demand, and demand and supply. If there's excess demand, prices go up. But this is caused by supply shortages. And perfectly predictable. If you don't, in the United States, for instance, the car companies forgot to order chips. A little mistake. So when the pandemic ended, they wanted to start producing cars. People wanted to buy cars. They couldn't produce cars. And the result of that is car prices went way up. And that was a very big part of our inflation. But there also was a shortage of food. Food prices went up. Energy prices went up, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all of that led to inflation. The interesting thing in the United States, where we don't have we didn't make the terrible mistake of getting excessively dependent on Russian gas.
Do you say something about Europe, or? Is
yeah. I wrote in one of my books. I hate to say I told you so, but I'm about to say that. In one of my books called "Making Globalization Work" that I wrote in 2006, I said very explicitly it was very, very foolish for Germany and Europe to become so dependent on Russian gas. Whatever you think of Russia, it was not reliable. And what I say now, the sun is not reliable, but solar renewable energy is so much more reliable than being dependent on authoritarian governments.
But maybe that's because we're in Europe, we believe in the goodness of everyone, even in Putin, and we believe in interdependence and world trade and trade, that we should all connect to each other.
Yeah, some of that is cross-Atlantic. Our President Bush said he looked into the eyes of Putin, and he said, "This is somebody I can trust."
Yeah.
But when I went to Russia, I didn't think that. But the fundamental problem was the reliance on markets. And markets work sometimes, as I said before, but not others. Markets don't reflect the consequences of CO2 pollution and global climate change. You just don't deal with that. Markets also don't deal well with risk. And that was the point I was trying to make. Being dependent on Russian gas was extraordinarily risky, but markets are short-term. And they said, we can get Russian gas for a little bit cheaper and we can save a little money. Looking forward, you say, well, that's a stupid thing to do. Because if Russia changes and something happens and you don't have Russian gas, you're going to be in a difficult place.
I used to work in politics, and whenever you lose an argument, which happens quite often, then you just say, let's look to the future. So how do we solve this problem of inflation now it's here?
Well, so first, what I said is it's a supply side problem. And
which means it's a supply side problem, which means for all trade economists
that the cost of production are going up, oil and energy and food, and that leads prices to go up. But some of that is temporary. Like, we didn't forget how to make cars. We still know how to make cars, as bad as they are, but we are learning how to even to make electric cars. So as soon as we got chips, the car production would start, and the price of cars would go down. And that's what's happening. If you talk to, I had a chance to talk to the CEO of one of the big car companies. He said, by the end of the year, we're going to have the car problem solved, and the price will come down. The price of energy went way up. It's still high, but in the United States, it's come down. So inflation in the United States actually over the last 2 months has been zero. So we've gotten, I don't want to say it's going to stay there, but if you get control of of these factors that are driving the prices, inflation will come down. The important point I want to make, though, is raising interest rates is not going to cause there to be more energy, more food, more cars. It's not going to solve the problem.
But it will take heat out of the economy, right?
Yeah, if you take enough heat out of the economy and cause a deep enough depression, prices will be moderated. Yeah. But the cure is worse than the disease. It's not going to have a very big effect. Better are some of the things that actually Europe is trying to do, which are supply side effects. Try to curb the price of energy. The way Europe priced energy, linking it with the cost of gas, led to an enormous disturbance. It's not like the average cost of energy, of electricity, is going up 1,000%. It's going up a lot, but it's not anywhere near as much as the price of electricity is going up in England and many other countries.
So, as a politician, what do you do? I think for a normal Danish family, it will be an additional cost of almost 1,500 euros, $1,500 a month with the electricity price going up. What should you do as a politician in this environment?
So let me first talk about the United States, because that's easier, and then come to Europe. For the United States, it's actually relatively easy. America is close to energy neutral. So the increase in the price of energy has been nothing but a redistribution from ordinary consumers to the fossil fuel companies. They're the winners, and Americans, consumers, ordinary households, are the losers. And it's just a redistribution. So the answer is pretty obvious. A windfall profits tax is what you ought to impose, with the proceeds distributed in ways that protect the most vulnerable. It's so obvious.
Windfall property tax, that's a tax on super profit, right?
On the increase in profits. It's not, when I sometimes jokingly say that, CEOs and companies say they need to get a reward for their efforts. So I jokingly say, if Exxon had actually been behind the war in Ukraine and had persuaded Putin, then you might argue that Exxon ought to get rewarded, perversely, and probably sent to jail. But the fact is, he had nothing to do with it. So why is Exxon getting all these profits? Why is the CEO going to get rewarded, I'm sure, with a bonus because profits have gone up? Was it anything that he did to deserve it? Absolutely not. But, so the answer is very, very simple. We know what the normal profit level is. all the excess of profits ought to be taxed away, and then redistributed to those who are suffering.
And now you have 30 seconds to answer the hard part, Europe.
Well, Europe obviously is in a more difficult position, but there are enormous excess profits still in many of the companies that are involved in the energy market. So there are still oil producers who are making a bundle. Gas producers are making a bundle. One of the interesting things is that Norway, which is one of the beneficiaries, has made statements about a willingness to pay those extra taxes to help the rest. So, you know, when there's a little bit of social solidarity, you actually get a support for a windfall profits tax.
It sounds more difficult in Europe, I think.
Well, I mean, if there were more companies like Equinor, which is the new form of Statoil. All the oil companies don't want to label about oil, so they've changed their names, like BP being Beyond Petroleum, rather than the British Petroleum. But the fact is, they are making lots of money in a way that cannot be justified in terms of just deserts for their efforts, and at the same time, parts of our population, European population, are suffering enormously.
In 2002, you wrote this book, Globalization and Its Discontent. It was like, it's an instant classic, I think it's fair to say. Is this the end of globalization we are seeing now?
I think globalization is really being challenged. I mean, there are certain aspects of globalization that have really, I think we should call attention to and celebrate right now. For instance, if you think about the pandemic and the production of the vaccine, when I think about how that was produced with the basic research done by a Hungarian woman working in an American university, and then brought to market largely by some Turkish scientists working in a German company. That's an example of globalization that worked well, where it's a globalization of ideas, where scientists all over the world pooled their ideas together to very quickly generate a vaccine against COVID-19. But then you look at other aspects of where we are today, things are very ugly. I mean, the fact that the WTO refused to give a waiver on intellectual property for the COVID-19 vaccine, even though governments financed more than 90% of the cost, resulting in, tens of thousands of people dying and probably hundreds of thousands, millions getting the disease unnecessarily, and allowing the disease to fester so it can mutate and hurt us with mutations that were more contagious or more dangerous. That was a real failure of globalization, where the rules that we have constructed really exhibit a kind of selfishness that has undermined global solidarity enormously. But right now, there are two things going on that are, I think, long-term, three things probably, that are going to undermine globalization. The first two are obvious. The war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously has polarized the world. The U.S. probably overcharacterizes it as a war between democracy and authoritarianism. But that then fits into the second issue, which is the U.S., and this is bipartisan, has developed a real opposition to China. And How this plays out is a matter of speculation, but clearly it's going to. Europe is being caught in the middle of that particular battle. And the third is exhibited, in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The developing countries were very supportive of the West in the resisting the attack on Ukraine, but that has waned. And that's partly because of the increase in food and energy prices, but partly out of a real anger at how we treated COVID-19 vaccines. What we thought was a battle just about intellectual property in Europe, in Geneva, has global ramifications because the West was so selfish that, there was all that vaccine hoarding that they called vaccine apartheid, and they were left to die, has, I think, left a bitterness that I feel very strongly in the third world. So that there has been an increasing split.
So we should be really worried about globalization, that this could be the end of globalization.
I wouldn't say the end, but it will be a reshaping. The doctrines that about free flow of goods, capital across countries, it's always a little bit of a myth. That idea, I think, is really being questioned. And let me just give you one example. You may know that the United States passed some $250 billion bill to try to get a chip industry inside the United States. Industrial policy to try to strengthen the production of chips so we wouldn't be so dependent on Taiwan. To me, what was so interesting about that, and I think it's a good idea that we have that capacity, but it violated the WTO rules without any question. But there was no questioning in the United States about that. No one, nowhere in the media, when I talk to Secretary of Commerce or we talk to anybody, no one asked the question, well, is this consistent with WTO rules? WTO was viewed almost as an institution of ancient history.
I think we're way too busy watching the Kardashians, so that's probably why they don't react. But the war in Ukraine, that really made attention, and there's a lot of political impact on what's going on in Ukraine. Right now, throughout the Western world, in Europe and in the US, there's a huge increase in defense spending. Is that a wisely way to spend our money?
Well, you wish you didn't have to spend money on defense. I once, I wrote one book in the midst of the war in Iraq, where I was very concerned about all this defense spending. And I said, we were spending, billions and billions and billions of dollars on weapons that didn't work against enemies that didn't exist. But the fact is that the Russian invasion is a message that we still live in a world where things happen where we have to defend ourselves. Now, I think we have to think more carefully. In general, the kinds of wars, conflicts we're likely to fight are going to be different, and more of the spending obviously has to be on cybersecurity than it was before. But for Europe, I think there is an important lesson, not so much of the war in Ukraine, but having to do with the United States. I think you have to ask the question, what would have happened if Trump were the president when Russia invaded? No, I mean, that's a scary question, but it is a hypothetical that is not that far from reality. I mean, he claims he won the election in 2020, but I mean, the reality is that there is a certain riskiness of American politics that you cannot that 80% of the Republican Party has become a cult, where they are trying to suppress free elections. They are trying to gerrymander. They are trying to prevent African Americans, Hispanics from voting. They're trying to, actually make sure that people who are the registrar, who oversees the electoral process, are partisans and will not give a fair reading. So, as sad as it is for me, I think the reality is that Europe has to rely on itself. And that means you do have to spend more on your own defense. I really think it is important for anybody who believes in democracy and human rights.
You're one of the strongest critics of the European Union, especially the European Monetary Union. Do you think that we are able to take care of ourselves, or do we still need our American big brother to look after us?
My criticism, what I said was that the euro was a halfway house. And as a halfway house, it was not stable. You either had to have, it was an economic arrangement where the economics had gotten ahead of the politics. And my view was, I hope that the politics will catch up with economics. So I think the right answer is that there needs to be closer economic and political integration in Europe. And with the events that have happened since then, both on the side of what we see in Russia and to some extent in China, and what you see in the United States with Trump, I think this imperative for Europe to become more politically united becomes even stronger. So to me, that is the answer to the problems that I see in the euro.
But since you made that advice, we had Brexit, so something went wrong.
Yeah, and I think they regret it. And I think they wouldn't do it again. But, history has a way of going in a particular direction.
Let's move back to the US. November 8th, what will you be doing?
Well, obviously, everybody will be watching these elections. I'm hopeful. Yeah. And I'm particularly hopeful with the Senate for a very bad reason, that the Republicans have overreached. And it's a real example of ideology trumping reason and strategy. So when the Republican Supreme Court, using really bad law and bad reason, bad logic, decided to reverse Roe versus Wade, what that did is energized large fractions of the population. Now, the Supreme Court had made a lot of other bad decisions too, and I could go through them. That would be getting into the weeds of American politics, about judgments about administrative law, environmental law. Every decision they make is so contrary to what I think is reason, and it's had, I think, extraordinarily divisive effect on America, not only because of the nature of the decisions themselves, but Roe versus Wade, for instance, has made people who are more progressive in America feel even more that this Constitution that was written 240 years ago, written by a group of rich, white, slave-owning men, of what legitimacy does that have in the 21st century? And before this Supreme Court, we had a process where people were trying to say, yes, we know that, let's forget that origins of that Constitution, and we'll adapt this piece of paper to the times as they change. And that makes sense. But these ideologues on the right are saying, oh, these were great, wise men who got an oracle from heaven, and we now have to interpret that oracle, and we can't dispute. We interpret it as if we were living in 1789. I mean, can you believe that?
Talking about old white men with power, 20th November, it's a big day. Biden is turning 80. So here's an old white guy. How is he?
I don't think he's that old. Let me say that. No, I think I don't. I'll dispute that. But that's not. That's not particularly
Are you
old.
invited to his birthday?
What?
Are you invited to his birthday?
No. I haven't.
Okay, then we have the old, influential white guy called Bernie Sanders. He turned 81 last week. How is the Democratic establishment doing?
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of good younger men and women on the Democratic Party. Most of these do not get the attention of internationally.
Are we talking about Hillary Clinton? Or?
No, we're talking about the governors of Michigan as one example. And then there are male governors in Illinois and California that are very good and dynamic. So I think, and you have to remember, I think people in Denmark will appreciate, you have about 6 million people. A governor of California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and I don't know the exact number, but is probably 30, 40 million people. So, I mean, the experience of being a governor in a state like California or even Michigan or Illinois is a real experience. So, these are people who are experienced political leaders who I think are very talented. And so I think there's a lot more talent in the Democratic Party than you're seeing at the top.
Okay, so you're an optimist.
I'm an optimist.
55% of the Americans, they disapprove of Biden. What about you? Have you been satisfied with the president so far? Yes,
actually. I think he's managed an extraordinarily difficult situation. He began with a pandemic ravaging the country, and with a former president who thought the way to solve the problem of COVID-19 was to drink chlorine because it would kill the germs. It would also kill you, but that was a minor detail. He inherited this country that was both very divided and ravaged by this disease. Now, he came into office trying, with an agenda of trying to calm the country down, and at the same time address both the disease and the economic fallout. He put forward a really successful vaccination program. and a economic program that made the economic downturn in the United States much less than anywhere else in the world that had been comparable. Remember, we had more than 1 million people die from COVID-19. So that was really managed well. And at the same time, he used those funds to begin to address some of the social problems. Childhood poverty in the United States, which is really unacceptably high, was reduced in 1 year by 40%. So, that was a real achievement. He did not succeed in getting the disease down as quickly as possible. That was because of the irrationality that he had to deal with. What I don't know anybody could have dealt with the anti-vaxxers, people who refuse to wear masks. The whole reaction against science was something that was very difficult, I think, impossible. I don't know if anybody could have dealt with that. Then we had the further political problem that he didn't really control the Senate. There was 1 or 2 people who were probably best described as closet Republicans, who made it very difficult to get anything through. But he finally got a large number of bills through. He got the largest climate change bill. It also did a lot for healthcare costs. He got this bill on industrial policy through. First time we've ever had anything like that to try to steer our economy. He got a gun control bill through, a veterans bill through. So it was, in that package, a lot of achievements.
So all in all, you're satisfied with the president. And now I have a really, really tough question, and it's yes or no. Should he run for re-election?
I think...
Yes or no? No.
I think if Trump runs, it will be very tempting for him to run. But I think if a younger Republican runs, I think almost surely it will be a younger Democrat that will run.
2 years from now, Biden, he will be 82. And which brings me to the subject of...
That's still young.
He's still young.
You have to remember, with modern medicine, 82 is really 62.
I think we know that. We know that. Yeah. Boomers versus Zoomers. Like there's so many tensions in our societies and in our economy, and there seems to me that there's a generational gap. Like people, how many people is under 30 years old here in the audience? I'm so sorry for you guys. Are you sorry for them as well?
It is an important dimension of inequality in our society. I've written a lot about inequality, but inequalities across generations is an important topic that has not gotten the attention that it deserves. And I think you might say the two worst aspects of this inequality are climate change, that we're giving them a world that's burning, and I'll be gone before it fully burns. But I think it's a real serious problem that we need to address. But the second more mundane issue, very evident in the United States and many countries in Europe, is young people can't afford housing. And part of the reason for that is the low interest rates that have been maintained, the excessively low. I complained before about excessively high interest rates. But I also think that excessively low interest rates can be a problem. Since 2008, since the global financial crisis, interest rates have been close to zero. And we have interest rates that are that low, it obviously inflates asset prices. And the owners of those assets were older people, by and large, and they become if you were wealthy enough in the beginning, you got even wealthier. And that is part of the reason why there's such high wealth inequality today. But that is a barrier to younger people getting a house.
Is it easy to fix?
Well, I think it's not easy to fix, but I think one has to recognize that there is this intergenerational equity problem. And the result of that is I think you need to do subsidies for people who are younger people buying a house and capital gains taxes on the capital gains that people have gotten on their old houses. It wasn't anything they did. It was monetary policy that was really the driving force behind these large capital gains. And I think that creates these inequities, a little bit analogous to the inequities we were talking about before. And when you have these inequities, you ought to tax the windfall gains and help those who are being hurt.
Is this generational gap, is that more important than the concept of classes?
I think it is a first order of importance. There is still, there are still large differences between the poor and the rich. Denmark, at least a lot of the statistics that I've seen, is one of the countries where there's more social mobility than others. The United States, talks about the American dream, but when you look at the data, the American dream is a myth. That, yes, there are a few people who make it from the bottom to the top. And that's why newspapers write about them. They're so unusual that it's a good story. But when a social scientist talks about, a dream or an opportunity, what we mean is what is the probability? And the probability of somebody at the bottom making it to the top is very low in the United States, actually lower than in almost any of the other advanced countries. And in Denmark, it's higher than in Scandinavia more generally, it's higher. And I think that's one of the attributes that you should make sure that you could do everything to keep.
Talking about success, which is very interesting. If I say the name Elon Musk, what do you say?
Well, I think it's a mixed picture. I think he's done a very impressive job of succeeding in creating an electric car earlier than other people. I mean, now everybody's into it, but that was an important innovation, and he did it with determination. On the other hand, many of his other activities, statements, we don't need to send more people out in outer space, wasting all that money, when we have so many problems here on Earth. I mean, it seems a little bit incongruous. And I'm very concerned when he at first tried to get Twitter. Now he doesn't want to get Twitter. But to have a major media, way people communicate, controlled by somebody whose views are so peculiar, and who doesn't believe in social harms. I mean, you have a regulatory framework here, or you're about to get a regulatory framework here that may be able to mediate, to restrict some of those social harms from social media. But in the United States, we have no really good mechanism, and I worry a lot about having somebody like Musk controlling a major way that ideas get disseminated.
And he's also I think he's the richest person in the world. And that's something that really changed also the conversation about our economy, that we have these super rich people. And there's this income gap, the inequality is growing and growing. These super rich people should we be grateful because like they contribute with their entrepreneurship? You say that Elon Musk, like he made this electric car Tesla, and like Jeff Bezos made Amazon and so on. Like there has been like Mark Zuckerberg and the Google brothers. Like they really made some great inventions. Like so.
Well, some of these are, you know, you have to ask. They made important innovations. They were built on, most of them, on basic research that was funded by the public. They would not have existed without the internet. And the internet was funded publicly. The creation of the internet was done largely by the US government, but some other governments, funded publicly. You couldn't have it without a browser, financed publicly. So their success is based on publicly funded research. Secondly, somebody like Zuckerberg made an innovation that was not that much different from alternative platforms. His was successful, the others not. And those, we call those network externalities, when lots of people join on one platform. But that was almost an accident. If you said they had gone to the other one, would the world have been much different? No. And a lot of his money comes from what I think socially destructive behavior. Getting engagement, and the way of getting engagement is getting enragement. And so I think they played a very important role in the polarization of our society, and we know they played a role in some of the worst things that have happened, like the massacre of the Rohingyas in Myanmar. So, you know, some of their success is built on really socially harmful activity. But whatever you think about that, the fact of the matter is, they would have engaged in that entrepreneurial activity if we taxed them a lot more. If we taxed them at 90%, they still would have done that. You know,
can you repeat?
Rather than having
did you say 90%?
Yeah, I said 90%.
90%, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
If rather than having 300 billion, they had only 30 billion, that's enough to live.
Oh.
You know, and...
So, Professor Stiglitz, just to sum up, like we shouldn't worry too much about inflation. We should spend more money and tax the rich more, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm starting to getting nervous. Is that because I have just?
Well,
been...
if you have 300 billion, maybe are you worried about losing 270?
No, I'm worried about growth in our society. I'm
no, that's
worried
not.
about
the point I made is that these guys, most of them are guys, would have done the same entrepreneurial activity, and their growth was founded on public investment. And we can't have public investment without public resources. And if we took that money and recycled it in more basic research, better infrastructure, spending that creates more social solidarity rather than the kind of polarization that we have in the United States, we would be a more productive society. When we cut the taxes, when Trump cut the taxes in 2017 on the very rich and on the corporations, the promise was cutting the taxes would lead to more investment. It didn't. It didn't lead to any more. What it did lead to was more share buybacks, more dividends, more money in the pockets of some of the very richest, but a public sector that was starved, so that we were not able to respond as effectively as we could have to COVID-19.
Do you know this joke? Two dignitaries are watching a military parade. At the very end, after all the tanks and missiles and marching men, comes a wagon with a few shabby, poorly dressed civilians inside. Who are they? The first man asks the second. Oh, the second man replies, those are economists. You wouldn't believe the damage they can cause. And the reason I mention this joke is that, like, you've been talking about ideology is such an important part of the profession of economics, and that's I'm probably brainwashed since I'm worried about the future of economics and our society when I'm talking to you. What is going to happen right now in the profession of economics for like the next 10 years?
Well, first let me say, I sometimes jokingly say that economists ought to take the Hippocratic Oath. When you become a doctor, you have to take the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. And there was one occasion where the president of a country wanted to know whether he should sign a free trade agreement with the United States. And I happen to know that president had been a doctor and had signed the Hippocratic Oath. So I asked him, you're a doctor, you did sign the Hippocratic Oath. And he said, yes. And I said, well, then you can't sign the free trade agreement because you're committed to doing no harm. So I think this is actually a very optimistic time for the economics profession, because we've had 40 years of what is sometimes called neoliberalism, the idea that markets solve all problems, and it hasn't. That shouldn't be news. That growth has been slower than it was before the era of neoliberalism. Most of that growth benefits of that growth have gone to the very top. There's been a lot more instability. We faced an inequality crisis, a climate crisis. And finally, within the economics profession, not universally, but increasingly, especially among young people, there's an awareness that those set of doctrines have failed, and there's a search for a new thinking about how do we, to go back to the first question, how do we organize society to make sure that there is an allocation of resources that is efficient, that promotes growth, but is also just and fair. And that is a question, about something that is just and fair and that addresses issues across generations like climate change. That was totally outside the domain of standard economics for 40 years.
Thomas Piketty, did you read all his books from the first page to the last?
I have to admit, no. If I had, I think I would have been underwater.
But you know his arguments, right?
What?
You know his arguments, like his.
I know his arguments.
Yeah.
I know him very well. Yeah.
And he's part of a new generation of economic thinkers that will change the profession from the inside.
Yeah, I mean, he's very, very concerned about inequality. He's provided an enormous data set that allows us to study inequality across countries over time, that has really enlightened us about the magnitude of that inequality. And his most recent book, I think he's made a real effort to show how looking at these issues from a broader perspective, bringing in history and politics, is going to be the way you have to approach these questions.
He's become insanely popular. Why is that, you think?
Well, I think people are really concerned about these issues, which were not widely discussed within economics. I mean, even today, say, standard courses in economics do not even mention inequality or do not discuss inequality. I teach a required graduate PhD course in economics, but it's a course that's required because the standard courses have excluded most of the things that are interesting, I think. So in our course, we talk about inequality, we talk about innovation, we talk about behavioral economics, but so much of what is of interest today is not included in the standard framework. So I think what he's talked about resonates with the problems of global society today.
I know that in the audience we have many Danish business leaders. Should they be concerned about inequality?
Yes, and you can say that they should be concerned for several reasons. I mean, the most fundamental, you might say, is moral. That what is a just society? And just because you're a business leader, you're still part of society. And so everybody should be thinking about these questions. But secondly, I think a divided society doesn't function well. And, what I say to people in Europe, in places like Denmark, look at the United States. If that's what you want, don't think about equality. If you want a very divided society, and you see what that does to tear apart the fabric, the inability to make public investments, the inability, to resolve common issues, that comes in part because we have an excessively divided society. And finally, I think it's good business. I think workers who are not paid decent wages are not likely to be as productive.
So the business of business is still business?
It's part of what they have to do, and I think, but all of these come together. I mean, there was a dinner at Davos that I go to every year, and these are some very important leading business. And a couple of years ago, one of the striking conversations was that one of the business leaders said he hadn't realized that a majority of his workers were not getting a living wage. And in the United States, you have the minimum wage is $7 and a quarter. That roughly $15,000 a year, and you can't quite pay rent for that in New York City. And there are a lot of firms paying that minimum wage. And what he did after I was surprised that he didn't realize that, but some of our previous meetings had induced him to go back and look at what his salaries, what he was paying. And he raised all of his workers' salaries to what he viewed as a livable wage, well above the minimum wage. He felt better about it, but I think he also felt it was better for the company.
Better business, sure.
Better business.
Time is running so fast, and we have some people in streaming. We have to say goodbye to them now. Bye. It's been a pleasure to have you around somewhere in the world. And now we open the floor for questions. So.